I want to talk about change. If we looked up the meaning of the word change in the dictionary, it's defined as, quote, the process of becoming different, end quote. Now, we're all kind of familiar with change, or should be by now, with one provision, and that unfortunately is that many of us tend to view change as something external that just happens to us. It's a little bit masochistic on our part, seeing ourselves as somehow the victim of change, the victim of life. It's a certain passivity. When we study intense solar change, or the possibility of change at eclipse times, we're speaking only of internal change and not so much external. So we might want to modify the above definition of change to something like, change is the process of how I become different and yet still remain the same. I become different, but I'm still the same me. Now that's something to think about. Watching how we change internally is not quite as simple as watching the outer events as they flicker by on the movie screen of life. Inner change can be much more personal than that, and we can be uncertain how to identify just who and what is changing, much less how to incorporate it and then go on from there. Just as the center of our earth is molten fluid, right? So our inner emotional worlds can be in upheaval, even while our outer appearance may appear calm to others. Only we can know what's going on in there, and most of the time we don't even know ourselves because we don't go there. Fires can be raging inside of us that never go out, and we just find it easier to ignore them, except perhaps, of course, when they erupt and reach the outside where others can see or sense them. We can be as surprised as anyone at our reactions at times. So my point here is that not only do many of us have little emotional control, but we're not used to touching ourselves or being touched in there. Like a bad tooth, it's just too sensitive. I'm not trying to exaggerate here, but rather just to point out that when we talk of being aware of our inner changes, much less incorporating them, without thinking, we may always tend to take a back seat to our own emotions, our own fears. In other words, we don't really know our inner self, our mind, that well, and may be passive to the changes that are taking place there, when what's required of us is to seize this window of change and, like clay, to actively work with it, to change ourselves rather than to be passively changed by circumstances. This kind of inner work requires not only being clear, clarifying our emotions so that we're not always just in reaction to them, we get a little lead on them, but also getting to know the mind itself, within which all of these emotions and thoughts reside. Now, for most of us, that involves mind training, meditation, and so on. And I'm not going to go into that here. Most of you know my thoughts on meditation by now, that it's a good thing. What I am saying here is that when change comes, internal change, it's not things changing us, with us being what's changed, but rather that we ourselves change. And that's much more difficult to assess and monitor. How do we change, often despite ourselves, and then still tell that if we've lost something in the transition? as far as I know, the simple truth is that when we change internally, we don't really know how we are different from what we were before the onset of the change. This shouldn't be news. It's always been this way. And this fact is part of why inner change is so scary. We're monitoring our own change, and yet we are also, the self, I, you, we're also what is changing. So that seems like a logical impossibility, which simply means, c'est la vie, this is life. Always has been just like this. And this little paradox is why words like faith and trust are of such long life. Sooner or later, the process of interchange, of what's going on in there, requires that we let go of any meaningful ideas of control and actually just abandon ourselves to the very process of life, the life process itself. We trust because we have no choice. We're going to be changed or liberated, like it or not. And now for maybe some closure here. If you've followed my train of thought this far, in particular this last part, then you can understand why grasping interchange is problematical, especially if we seize up or start to freak out and are unable to free float and to trust ourselves to the forces that be. This trust requires that we're relatively unattached, and sooner or later we will be anyway. To use an example, to do that, we have to go from our embryonic inward curl, the baby in the womb, to literally bending over backward, turning ourselves inside out spiritually. In other words, just let go. We need to have our hands free, metaphorically speaking, to work with change. Creativity, what we call creativity, is working with change successfully and being one, becoming one with aligning ourselves with the forces of change. We all know the phrase, may the force be with you, but we may not be as familiar with the reverse, may we be with the force.